our friend Geoffrey Miller, Genes. Welcome, 12 minutes.
So if you have the honor and privilege of being here at Ciudad de las Ideas, you already know that genes are important. If you're interested in science, you already know genes are important. But you know that in your minds. What I want to do here is convince you in your hearts that genes are both important and good. That genes are not guilty. Genes are not your enemies, they're not your oppressors. Rather, they are your most intimate companions. They are the greatest gift that your parents and your ancestors gave to you. So I'll talk about how genetic similarities and differences between people, even between species, help put our lives in a biological context. I'll talk about heritability, identity, ancestry, ethnicity. I probably won't have time to talk about humanity, but if I do, I will. We've had many decades of behavior genetics, twin studies, adoption studies, and new molecular genetic studies showing that every important psychological trait that you can measure reliably is influenced by genes to some degree, sometimes mildly, sometimes quite strongly. The molecular genetic studies, the new methods, are particularly compelling because they don't make some of the same assumptions that twin studies and adoption studies make. These are the studies that use DNA chips, where you get cheek swabs from people, you genotype them. These are the genome-wide association studies, the very exciting new genomic complex trait analysis studies, the runs of homozygosity studies. If you're interested, Google them. They all converge on showing the heritability of every major mental illness, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, very high heritability for intelligence and the sort of personality traits that Catherine was talking about, openness to experience, agreeableness, etc. But also at the recent behavior genetics meeting in Edinburgh, Scotland, we had lots of people doing this kind of work talking about the heritability of moral values, what you value morally. The heritability of political attitudes. Do you vote liberal or conservative? How strongly do you have religious beliefs? Even altruism is heritable. Sexual behaviors, your likelihood of ever getting married, your likelihood of getting divorced, your parenting style, these are all heritable. Economists are getting very interested in the heritability of economic decision-making and consumer preferences. And I've published papers showing that how often you have orgasms as a woman is heritable, about 40%. It's not just which mate you choose, it's the genes you get from your parents. And the most recent study we did showed that how often you talk or text on your mobile phone has a heritability of about 40 to 50%. Why? It's not that you've got genes for using mobile phones, it's that you've got genes for personality traits like extroversion and wanting to talk to people, or not being able to articulate what you want to say very well and taking longer. My dad's a lawyer. I also apparently have genes for dressing like a lawyer. I'll skip that. One important thing to realize is DNA sequencing is getting very cheap and very widespread. A couple of months ago, I took a cheek swab myself and sent it in one of these little kits off to Beijing, where they're doing something called the Cognitive Genomics Project. They're doing full DNA sequencing of some high intelligence folks, and they're looking for intelligence genes. They know they're going to find thousands. Now that I've heard Craig Venner's talk that you might be able to send my entire genome by radio to another planet, I'm a little worried about having an alien clone. But BGI is really leading the way in this, and if you look at how many next generation sequencers they've got, 166 as of July, most other major genomic centers have 10 or fewer. So China is really going to lead the way with this new DNA sequencing that'll revolutionize psychology and all the behavioral sciences. Identity, who shares my genes? Identical twins, like the famous Winklevoss twins who sued Facebook, cooperate particularly well and are particularly close because essentially they're clones. They have, the same genotype in two different bodies. And when it comes to crime, you often have people dressed like lawyers convincing juries like you guys about DNA forensic evidence. If some psychopath rapes you, you should go to a hospital and say, can I have a rape kit? Can I please see if we can get the DNA of the perpetrator? Because that's very compelling evidence. And that is telling you genetic identity is very important, not just biologically, but socially, in terms of culpability. And things like the Innocence Project, which are using DNA evidence to prove the innocence of people wrongly jailed, are using this very effectively now. They've had 300 convicted prisoners freed based on DNA evidence, of which 187 were black. For example, Joseph Fears Jr. here, wrongfully imprisoned for rape for 25 years. Finally, the DNA evidence exonerated him. And of course, that'll have implications for things like Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative that you heard about yesterday in terms of racial bias in criminal justice. Ancestry. People wonder, who are my parents? You can get home paternity test kits, right? If you're not sure that baby's really mine, what does really mean? It means, do they share my genes? You can go to the drugstore and find out. Adoptees who have been adopted into new families often want to know, who are my birth parents? It's important to their identity. And there are things like the Intercountry Adoption Registry that help adoptees find who are their birth parents. And there's a huge resurgence of interest in genealogy with things like Family Tree magazine, companies like Ancestry.com or GeneBase that'll help trace your ancestry using either traditional genealogical methods or new genetic methods. And most of you have many members of your extended family as Facebook friends who would never be your friends if they weren't family, right? Particularly for Americans in the run-up to election, we noticed everybody who disagrees with my politics is probably a relative rather than a friend. You also wonder, who are my children? Young people who become egg donors or sperm donors often regret it later in life because they think, I don't even know how many kids I have. Who are they? Where do they live? Where are their environments? This is treated as a purely medical procedure, but it becomes an issue of identity and existential place in the world. Where are my kids? Personal genomics companies like 23andMe, you can now, by mail order, send them your DNA, and they can tell you exactly where every part of every chromosome in your genome came from in the world. Here's an example of an African American male, but actually he's 64% European and 4% Asian. 23andMe now can even tell you what percent of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. Because once we got the Neanderthal DNA from fossil bones, it was discovered, to the astonishment of many Europeans, that most Northern Europeans are about 2 to 4% Neanderthal. Well, you guys can find out now. Ethnicity is very important. The Kenyan town of Kogelo is particularly proud that Senator Obama became President Obama because that's where Obama's dad is from. It's actually become a bit of a tourism destination. And that's a very legitimate form of ethnic pride or racial pride. And many political movements that seek human rights and justice are based on a feeling of genetic similarity with others, shared ancestry. My ancestors were your ancestors. So Viva la Raza, Black pride, Native American pride, Chinese pride. These are all very important in giving you a sense of your identity. You can actually do computer averages of hundreds of faces from particular countries, make a computer average of all those faces and get a sense of what's the kind of archetypal face for each sex within each country. You can see Mexico up there on the upper right. And that's another possible source of ethnic pride, where you go, that's the prototype for my genetic group. That's the best of my gene pool. And those computer averaged faces tend to be very physically attractive, whether they're male or female. Genocide, we consider a particularly heinous crime because it's about exterminating a whole gene pool, not just killing individuals or families. So whether it's the Nazi Holocaust or the Rwandan genocides, we treat genocide very differently because in our hearts we recognize the importance of genes. Also, in terms of what makes us distinctively human, it's fascinating to realize that many other varieties of humans went extinct very recently. The recently discovered Denisovans in Asia almost lived to the present. They only went extinct 40,000 years ago. Neanderthals only extinct 40,000 years ago, and they probably had the blonde hair and blue eyes, as here, and looked quite a bit more like us than we used to think. And the recently discovered Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, only extinct 12,000 years ago. They almost made it to the present, even though they were only this tall and looked like hobbits. People are looking at their DNA, extracting their DNA from bones, and we'll know pretty soon what are the genes that distinguish us from them. That'll give us a clue to what distinguishes us as humans psychologically from them. Finally, what makes us so special? Vegans and animal rights activists are arguing, the genetic evidence shows we share a lot of our identity with other animals, and that means their thoughts, their feelings, their capacity for suffering is very similar to humans. So here again, the genes are good. The genes are on the side of animal rights, human rights, and justice. And so I think I hope you appreciate that genes are not just important, but they're also the foundation of your identity. Thank you.